The National Broadcasting Company presents another in a series of filmed conversations with distinguished figures of our time and invites you to visit with Mr. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., Chairman of the Board of Directors of the General Motors Corporation. His guest is Edward Stanley, Manager of NBC Public Service Programs.
I'm happy to be here and talk with you again, Mr. Sloan. Thinking back, Mr. Sloan, what would you say was the hardest problem you ever had to solve?
Well, I think I would say the hardest problem to me was the decision I had to make when I graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
How old were you?
20 years old. Where did I fit into the American economy? What could I do? How would I do it? How would I go about to get it done? It was very definitely a period of frustration and discouragement. Of course, I guess discouragement means frustration.
How would you find a job?
I got a job in a small manufacturing company in Newark as a draftsman, as a salesman, an errand boy, and about everything else. The company had about 10 or 15 employees. It was struggling along on a new thing, and through the force of circumstances, the way those things happen, I've been with that outfit as it's moved from place to place ever since. I really only had one job so far as the company is concerned.
Well, what did you do first?
I was a draftsman.
And then?
Well, while I was a draftsman, I also was a salesman. And then the company got into difficulties, and I was given an opportunity to see what I could do with the exalted title of general manager. And I made a little money the first 6 months, and that was the beginning.
How old were you then?
24 or 5.
Did you come from a family of businessmen?
No, I didn't. I think I could say that our family was largely professional people, educators in the ministry, and I wouldn't say there was much of a commercial background in our family. As a matter of fact, taking my own activities in life, I wouldn't say that I had distinguished myself particularly in a commercial way. My contribution to progress and to the business in which I spent my life is more in the way of engineering technique, improvement of our products, new devices, expansion of our business, and the management phases and the engineering phases of business more than the direct commercial or selling phases.
You think that your engineering background has helped you in your career?
I think, from my point of view, it's been of tremendous importance. Of course, I've been engaged in all my life in technical industry. Technical problems were highly significant in the success of General Motors as an enterprise. Although I never practiced engineering as such, I wouldn't have the competence, for instance, to design an engine or to deal with an intricate piece of engineering because I've never had developed the background of that. But I understand the engineering language. And when a proposition came before General Motors as to what an engineering program should be, or whether we should expand in a new area of technology, I could listen to the arguments back and forth and make a decision based upon an understanding of the language. For that reason, I think that it has been of tremendous importance to me in the particular line that I followed. I think also that an engineering background, and I may be prejudiced from this point of view on account of my own experience, I think engineering as a background is a better training for the mind and helps a man in his afterlife as against perhaps an academic background, and that's particularly true if he gets into an enterprise that has engineering aspects.
Do you feel that industry ought to support our educational institutions?
I think when you ask that question, you sort of put the cart before the horse. I think we should first look upon the significance of our educational institutions. I speak of institutions of higher learning, both academic and technical institutions. I think they have a significance in our society and the development of our society that's very essential, and that for that reason they should be supported. The donations and grants have been made to our institutions of higher learning that have resulted in some of them having large endowments can't continue into the future, because the income tax takes so much out of the income of every individual that there's little left in relation to the demand to meet the expanding needs of our higher educational institutions of higher education. Therefore, we get to the point where they must seek support in places other than what they've enjoyed in the past. That means they've got to go to the government or they've got to go to business. And I feel very strongly that American enterprise, both corporate enterprise and individual enterprise, has got a real responsibility to support our institutions of higher learning. And if they don't do that, they are bound to come under the government sooner or later, and therefore their activities are likely to be influenced by the political consideration. And outside of the purely educational aspects of our educational institutions of higher learning, they make a very important contribution in research, in studying the problems of our society, because they have the talent to do it. They live in an atmosphere that's conducive to that sort of thing. And that's true not only in the scientific institutions, but in the academic institutions as well.
You're talking about pure research, Mr. Sloan.
Yes, I was, Mr. Stanley. I think it's a fact that before the war, comparatively little basic research was conducted in this country. Most all our great fundamental discoveries in basic research have had a foreign aspect to it. We've been great capitalizers of the work of foreign research, but we haven't been creators. But now we're getting into the creative stage. And the point I want to make is that we must look to our educational institutions of higher learning, because as I said before, they have the talent, they operate in a climate that's conducive to fundamental study, they have the time, and everything's in their favor to develop this basic research, which hasn't immediately any industrial application.
What way do you see that business can give this financial support and not infringe on the broad freedom of inquiry?
Well, I'm not particularly concerned on that because when business supports an educational institution, it doesn't follow through and attempt to control the thing. It's not interested in that. It's interested in the end result. On the other hand, I think if our the financial support and ultimately the control of our educational institutions moves over to the government, the political factor becomes more significant than the business factor.
Mr. Sloan, you have had a tremendously intensive experience in the creation of and conception of the modern American corporation, a social instrument characteristic of our times. It would be interesting to have your views on what kinds of services such organizations ought to perform for mankind, and particularly the ways in which we can expect them to develop in the future.
Well, that's a very embracive question, of course, and I think perhaps it might be well to take a look at what's happened in the last 60 years or so. I say 50 or 60 years because American industry has had a tremendous expansion, although I think perhaps the industrial age began somewhat before that, but the last 50 or 60 years has been tremendous in development. If you go back to that time era, you'll find that many of our enterprises, of course they weren't as large then as they are now, were in the forms of what I call proprietors. That is, some pioneer comes along and starts an industry, and most all of our industries have their genesis in that way. Usually that individual owned the business, or substantially owned the business. He may have had 2 or 3 partners. But the concept of a public ownership of business at that time hadn't developed very far. And I think that the attitude of mind of management at that time, these proprietors and their partners, was to largely a selfish one. They looked upon themselves as pioneers. They expected a bigger reward, and they handled the business purely from the standpoint of the business itself, rather than from any influences outside the business, or without any concept of what influence the business had on society in general. All right. Now, as time passed, the whole picture changed. Our enterprises got so big, required such tremendous aggregations of capital, it was impossible for any individual and a few partners to manage, or rather to finance such an enterprise. So we passed into the hands of largely a public ownership, where thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, own a business, as compared with this pioneer and his limited number of partners. Well, through evolution, there's been, and I'm quite confident of that, because my life has been spent in this time area, and I see it very clearly, that management is no longer concerned with the problem solely of delivering goods and services on an efficient basis at the lowest possible price to the consumer. But management now takes a real interest in the impact of their economic decisions on society as a whole. For instance, there was a time in this time period that I mentioned where if it suited the interest of the business better, they wouldn't hesitate to let large numbers of people out of employment. And they didn't recognize that that was a responsibility that they had. Today, one of the important policy decisions in the business to keep a level of employment as horizontal as we can. In other words, we hate to let people out. The old pioneer didn't care whether he let people out or not, because he hadn't moved into the time period where he recognized he had a responsibility for society in addition to his responsibility to his own self-interest. Otherwise, that, to my mind, is the great change that's taken place in the attitude of industrial management over the last 30 or 35 years.
Do you think that industry and labor are developing a more stable relationship?
Well, I think that is very, very true. I think that is happening. When you consider that question, you must recognize that it's only a comparatively few years that we've had these great labor organizations around the mass production industries. Before that, the labor organizations were largely confined to carpenters and plumbers and people like that, but not the mass production industry. That's only been going on since 1936 and 1937, and the war period was largely out. So the number of years that industry, management of industry, and the labor leaders have been brought in contact is quite limited in terms of time as a whole. And they had to learn their experience. They started with more or less of an antagonistic point of view toward one another, and that continues to some extent. But I think as they learn to see each other's problems, they sit around the bargaining table and discuss the problems of one is against the other. And as experience gains, I think that they're sure to develop a greater recognition on the part of each of the problems and limitations of the others.
What opportunities do you see for young men in the business world today?
Well, I think to answer that question, we'll have to first understand what we mean by opportunities. Do we mean opportunities for accomplishment in a physical sense, or do we mean opportunities to make money in a financial or an economic sense? So far as the first is concerned, there's no question but what the opportunities are far greater, far broader than they ever were before in the history of the United States. And if I were to look forward 15 or 20 years hence, I would say with certainty that they're going to be bigger and better at that time than they are even today. When it comes to the financial point of view, I think it's quite different. We must be looking forward not so much into the future, but comparing it with the past. If you go back to the period I was talking about before, say 50 or 60 years ago, there was a tremendous reward for a tremendous accomplishment. That's what made America possible. There was the maximum incentive to do the biggest job that our imagination and our energy could develop. But through the process of time, that has been changed. And through the impact of our very high income taxes, we've reached a point in this country where it's very difficult for a man, no matter how much ability he may have, no matter how much imagination he has, almost without regard to how much good fortune he may have, to get much of a competence when he retires. The most he can expect is to have a reasonable high standard of living while he lives. And that's bringing American industry to the point where we're getting into pensions and all kinds of things to try to protect the future of these men and who are leaders and who contribute so much to the management and development of these great enterprises upon which the progress of our society depends. It's a real problem to meet and to recreate the incentive that we had 50 or 60 years ago when we had a generous reward for a big job.
Mr. Sloan, what in your opinion offers the best special business opportunity for a young man?
I'm inclined to think that, for a young man who has a flair for selling, has a reasonable amount of executive ability to run a business, I think the opportunity that offers the most in through life and in a competence after life is to obtain the franchise of a good automobile, preferably in a comparatively small city. That offers an opportunity to capitalize the man's ability on his own account. It gives him a position in the community, and it also gives him an opportunity to develop a business and retain such profits as are proper in the development of the business, and ultimately to capitalize them on a capital gain basis rather than to pay out the taxes and pass the great majority of them, or more than that, over to the government. As a matter of fact, I think that the young man who has those qualifications, was ambitious and willing to work hard, will be better off in his years when he retires, following that route than he would even if he became a top executive in an important industrial organization with a big salary.
Mr. Sloan, what is the most important thing for a man to work toward in his career?
I'm a firm believer in the idea that every one of us have a certain amount of talent in certain directions. And in other directions, we may be completely void of talent. I think the problem is for every young man is to analyze himself And today there's a certain amount of scientific approach to self-analysis. I think he should analyze himself and find out that thing that he's most interested in and can do the best. Because success depends so much upon being interested in your problem. In that way, work becomes a pleasure and not a drudgery.
In recent years, Mr. Sloan, you have extended your interest to other areas, such as the Sloan-Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. Would you like to talk about that a little? What led you into that?
Well, the time came, Mr. Stanley, the time comes to all of us when Father Time taps us on the shoulders and business says, you're through. We want a younger fellow to run this business from that time on.
Sure.
And when the time came to me to do that very thing back in 1946, I tried to interest myself in other things in order to keep my mind in exercise and contribute what I could as long as I lasted. And previous to my retirement as Chief Executive Officer of the business, I had a little to do with cancer research through a friend of mine who got me interested in it. And as I contacted with the problem, I was amazed at the fact, and it was very true, this was just before the war and the early war. It was true that what I think is the greatest curse levied by nature on mankind was completely neglected from the standpoint of high-powered scientific attack on the problem. And so my conception was that we would lift that research out of the hospital and set it up by itself with a research building adequate to the needs, and try to apply the same principles in the attack on cancer that industry had applied so successfully on many problems that industry was concerned with, by concentration and by bringing to bear on the problem the highest scientific talent that was available.
What other interests occupy you now, besides this one?
Well, as I've already indicated in the questions that you've asked me, I'm interested in education, scientific education, and naturally I'm interested in management as a phase of scientific education. I established 2 years ago the School of Industrial Management at MIT, the idea being to superimpose upon the scientific or the technical education that MIT offers a course in management, so that the undergraduates and particularly postgraduates would learn the broader aspects of industry from the standpoint of the management phases as compared with the purely technical phases of engineering or whatever it might be. That school is now in process of development, and I think in the course of time it will make a very important contribution in raising the standard of competence of the management of our great industrial corporations.
Have you had any conscious motivation in life?
Well, not that I can identify, Mr. Stanley. I think that anybody that's been trying to run the business the way I have, the motivating force is the business itself. It's kind of a question of keeping up with the Joneses, trying to meet the problems inside, trying to meet the impact of the problems from outside on the business. And I think any executive in charge of an operation of the magnitude that I've been charged with, I think when the day's finished, the executive's finished too. It's purely a case of keeping up with the Joneses, and the Joneses is the business.
Out of your experience in business, Mr. Sloan, what do you think you have learned?
Well, I hope I can answer that question first by saying I don't hope I'm not through learning yet. Each day teaches me something that I had never experienced, appreciated before. I think it would surprise you, it would surprise business in general, if they appreciated how we seek facts before we make an executive decision. No amount of expense, no amount of trouble, no amount of time is spared in getting the facts to put constructively and dramatically before the executive or the group that has to make the decision. So we start with the facts. I think the next step is that I've learned is that we must analyze the facts with an open mind. I remember I was making a talk one time before our organization, and Will Rogers was a speaker too. And he heard me talk about this question of an open mind. He said the trouble with an open mind, the wind was likely to blow right through it from one side to the other.
Sure.
Well, of course, you mustn't do that. But you must have an open mind in developing the facts. And I think also I've learned that no problem, no matter how complicated it appears to be, is really complicated when you divide it into its component parts. You look at an intricate machine, you marvel at its complexity, and you say, whoever could build such a machine? But the mechanic who has to build the machine doesn't look at it as a complete machine, he looks at it as the component parts. And when you take it down into the component part, it's simplified, and you can understand it. It's the same way with the business problem. If your organization has the ability to break down a complex problem in its simplest part, in that way you can make the most constructive decision. As I make that observation, my mind goes back to a motto on my desk at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, my private office, sent to me by my distinguished associate, Dr. Kettering. It reads something like this: it may not be necessary or desirable to make a decision based upon the technological facts, but one cannot make the best decision without the technological facts are known and evaluated.
And what do you think you have not learned?
Well, I think my answer, Mr. Stanley, in this question will rather surprise you. That is the first answer, because from my point of view, there are two things I've learned. The first thing that I've not learned is how to give an executive order. Going back over my industrial experience, I don't ever remember issuing an order as such. If I had a proposition that I thought was in the interest of the business and that I could support, and I found that there was antagonism or many didn't agree with me, I'd back out of the proposition and do some selling and present it at a later time. And that way I could always get across by appealing to the ability and experience of our people and giving them an opportunity to think over a problem rather than issuing an order that antagonized them and didn't give the same amount of cooperation. The next part of the answer is that I've never learned to be a pessimist. Pessimism has no place in the American schemes of things. Many times during my industrial experience, things have looked discouraging, but there's always been a way out. And from my point of view, those kind of periods are periods to get ready for the next movement forward. I'm the greatest possible optimist on the future of America and our whole system. And therefore, I again say that what I have not yet learned to be a pessimist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sloan. I've enjoyed this.
For the past half hour, we have been visiting in his New York office Mr. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., Chairman of the Board of Directors of the General Motors Corporation, President of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Sloan-Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. His guest was Edward Stanley, manager of NBC Public Service programs in this, another of NBC's filmed conversations with distinguished figures of our time.